2 million shells. That is the number of rounds the Red Army fired on Berlin between April 20th and May 2nd, 1945. More artillery than the Luftwaffe had dropped on London in the entire war. Concentrated on a city of 400 square kilometres, where 2 million civilians remained trapped, most of them women, the elderly, and children. On May 2nd at 3 in the afternoon, General Helmuth Weidling signed the unconditional surrender of the garrison. But the 24 hours that preceded that signing, and those that followed it, do not fit into a military dispatch. They fit into the diaries of those who survived, into the mass graves that Soviet cleanup crews opened in the parks, into the 7,000 documented suicides recorded in that single week in the capital of the Reich. This is what happened in Berlin on the day the city fell. 12 a.m., May 2nd, 1945. At midnight on May 2nd, 1945, Berlin no longer existed as a city in any functional sense of the word. The electrical supply had collapsed on April 22nd. Running water, except from improvised hand pumps set up in courtyards and squares, had been cut off for days. Telephone lines functioned only in a handful of military bunkers. Reich radio had broadcast for the last time on the night of May 1st, announcing Hitler's death, which had in reality occurred 32 hours earlier, to the strains of Wagner and Bruckner's Adagio. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, under the Reich Garden, Adolf Hitler's corpse had been burning for more than a day alongside Eva Braun's in a bomb crater. SS Adjutant Otto Günscher had managed to gather 200 litres of gasoline after hours of searching through the destroyed garages. The cremation had been incomplete. The remains were still there, covered by a tarpaulin, while the bunker's garrison tried to decide what to do. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda had taken their own lives a few hours earlier, after an SS doctor administered morphine to their 6 children and Magda personally placed cyanide capsules in their mouths. Helga, the eldest, was 12 years old. Heidi, the youngest, 4. A subsequent Soviet autopsy would detect signs of resistance on Helga's body, bruising along the jaw, evidence that she had been held down by force. 12:30 a.m. General Hans Krebs, Chief of the Army General Staff, returned to the bunker after meeting with Soviet General Vasily Chukov at the 8th Guards Army headquarters, set up in a school in Tempelhof. Krebs had attempted to negotiate a partial surrender, a ceasefire that would allow the new government headed by Admiral Karl Dönitz, now entrenched in Flensburg, to organise a political capitulation. Chukov, following direct orders from Stalin transmitted by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had been unequivocal. Unconditional surrender or nothing. Krebs reported back to those present in the bunker. Then he sat down, wrote a brief note, and shot himself in the temple. General Wilhelm Burgdorf did the same. Their bodies remained in one of the map rooms where Soviet soldiers would find them a few hours later. 1 a.m. The Soviet radio unit of the 1st Belarusian Front picked up a transmission in German from the Chancellery sector. It was General Weidling, commander of Berlin's defences, announcing he was prepared to negotiate. He had made the decision without consulting Dönitz. He knew that any prolongation meant thousands more dead within hours. At that same hour, in a basement in the wedding district, a 34-year-old Berlin woman was writing in her diary. She did not sign her name. Decades later, she would become known as the anonymous author of A Woman in Berlin, one of the most precise chronicles of the civilian horror of those days. Hannelore Marek, a journalist by profession before the war, had been raped for the first time on April 27th by 3 Soviet soldiers on the landing of her building. She had lost count of the subsequent rapes. In those early hours of May 2nd, she wrote that the silence frightened her more than the shells. For 2 weeks she had heard nothing but artillery. The sudden absence of explosions made her fear that something worse was on its way. Imagine what it means to be in that moment. A city of millions holding its breath underground, not knowing whether what is coming is the end of the war or the beginning of something even worse. 2 a.m. General Weidling sent officers with a white flag across the front line. He did so from the bunker on Bendlerstrasse. The very place where, less than a year earlier, the conspirators of July 20th had been shot after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler. The geographic irony was precise. The place where the Reich had executed those who tried to surrender it was now the place from which its surrender would be carried out. The mass rapes that would mark Berlin's memory had not begun on May 2nd. They had already been underway for nearly 2 weeks. The most conservative estimates, based on records from the Charité Hospital and the clinical archives of the Free University speak of between 100,000 and 130,000 Berlin women raped between April 21st and May 5th. Other figures, which include multiple rapes of the same victim and clinically undocumented cases, put the number of incidents in the Greater Berlin area above 400,000. But the early hours of May 2nd had a particular character. With the surrender imminent and Soviet discipline having collapsed in many units due to looted alcohol, the assaults reached their peak. 3 a.m. Dr. Margaret Promnitz, gynecologist at the municipal hospital in Schöneberg, began receiving injured women who arrived on foot or were carried by relatives. Some were between 70 and 80 years old, others were teenagers. Promnitz, who had survived the war and later testify in clandestine medical studies, noted in her notebook that she had treated more than 50 women in a single night. She also noted that she had administered the last available doses of morphine without regard to severity, simply to ease what it was impossible to cure. We have no sutures, we have no antibiotics, we have alcohol and a few bandages. The women come in silence, almost all of them in silence. It is the silence that stays with you. Dr. Margaret Promnitz, gynecologist at the Schöneberg Municipal Hospital. The suicide toll in Berlin during that first week of May 1945 exceeds 7,000 confirmed cases. It is the largest documented wave of mass suicide in a European city in the 20th century. Entire families killed themselves together. Fathers poisoned their children before poisoning themselves. SS soldiers shot themselves in groups. Officials from the district offices of the National Socialist Party, aware of what awaited them, chose cyanide over the Soviet rope. Berlin's pharmacies had distributed thousands of cyanide capsules in the weeks prior, some through official party channels, others sold or given away by individual pharmacists who sensed what was coming. In the Pankow district, a single pharmacist named Ernst Hempel distributed more than 400 capsules in the 2 weeks before the fall. His own family used them on May 1st. 4 a.m. In the Tiergarten, what had been the green lung of central Berlin, the landscape had become lunar. The trees, the few still standing, were burned or split by shrapnel. Among the trunks lay the bodies of German and Soviet soldiers, dismembered horses, burned-out vehicles, and civilians. Older men of the Volkssturm who had been thrown there in the final hours with a Panzerfaust and the order to stop the T-34 tanks. One of them was Alfred Mehnert, a 67-year-old retired railway mechanic, father of 3 sons already dead on the Eastern Front. His 14-year-old grandson Gerhard accompanied him with a Karabiner 98K rifle. He survived only because his grandfather pushed him into a drainage channel as the Soviet column advanced. Alfred died there. Gerhard remained trapped underground for 2 days. When he emerged, he found his mother raped and dead by suicide in the family apartment in Moabit. These cases are not exceptional. They are the statistical norm of those days. 5 a.m. The first grey light of dawn began to define the silhouettes of destroyed buildings. Berlin, which in 1939 had 4,300,000 inhabitants, had been reduced to just over 2,100,000. The difference was explained by deaths at the front, forced evacuations, the deportations of Berlin's Jews murdered in the eastern camps, those who had fled westward to surrender to the Western Allies, and those who had simply disappeared without record during the Allied bombings of 1943 and 1944. Of the buildings in the city centre, 60% was completely destroyed or severely damaged. The city had received 45,000 tons of Allied bombs during the war, but the concentrated damage of the final 2 weeks, now subjected to Soviet artillery fire at close range, had been more devastating in urban terms than 4 years of strategic bombing. 6:30 a.m. General Weidling left the General Staff bunker on Hohenzollern-Damm, escorted by 2 Soviet officers. He moved toward the Soviet line carrying a white flag. His uniform was dirty, his face hollowed out. He was 54 years old but looked 70. He was taken to Chuikov's headquarters in Tempelhof. Vasily Chuikov, the general who had defended Stalingrad 3 years earlier against the German Sixth Army, and who now closed the circle by capturing the Reich's capital, received Weidling with protocolar coldness. The conversation lasted less than 40 minutes. Weidling signed the surrender document for the Berlin garrison at 6 o'clock in the morning on May 2nd, 1945. The surrender would come into force at 3 in the afternoon, allowing time to transmit the order to all scattered units across the city. Chuikov ordered thousands of copies of Weidling's proclamation to be printed immediately. It read, "The Führer has fallen. Those who swore loyalty to him are dead. By order of the Führer, you, German soldiers, were to continue fighting for Berlin, even though ammunition has run out and the general situation makes this resistance futile. I order the immediate cessation of resistance. 7 a.m. In a basement in Friedrichshain, 9-year-old Helga Hauthel was writing in a school exercise book what her mother dictated to her. Her mother, bedridden with dysentery and extreme weakness, had decided to leave a record for the absent. Her husband Walter had been missing since the Battle of Smolensk in 1943. Her eldest son Klaus had died in Italy in 1944. The mother dictated, "Today is the day. Something has changed in the air. You can no longer hear the big guns, only scattered shots. If anyone reads this, let them know that we held on. That we held on until the end. Helga, write the date clearly. The 2nd of May, 1945. Helga survived. The exercise book is preserved in the archive of the German Historical Museum in Berlin, donated by her in 2008 before she died. 8 a.m, Soviet loudspeakers mounted on trucks began moving through the streets, broadcasting Weidling's surrender order in German and Russian. The announcers were German prisoners of war from the National Committee for a Free Germany, an anti-fascist organisation created in captivity under Soviet supervision. Their voices, German-accented but measured and official, reached the basements where civilians had spent weeks hearing no human voice but the cries of their own. Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a member of a clandestine resistance circle known as Onkel Emil, heard the broadcast in a basement on Wilmersdorfer Strasse in Charlottenburg and went out into the street for the first time in 4 days. Her diary, later published under the title Berlin Underground, recorded that morning. She noted that the light hurt her eyes, that the air smelled of burning, of corpses, and of something sweet she could not identify. That smell, described by dozens of witnesses, was a mixture of decomposing human flesh, gas from burst sewers, and fuel residue. We came out like animals that have been in their burrow too long. We came out without joy. Peace does not look like peace. It looks like another form of waiting. Ruth Andreas Friedrich, member of the Onkel Emil Resistance Network. 9 a.m, the first Soviet units entered the Reich Chancellery. Soldiers of the 79th Rifle Corps, commanded by General Semyon Perevertkin, moved through the devastated halls. They found documents, uniforms, the remains of Hitler's personal office, with his desk still standing and walls covered in fragments of fallen marble. In the bunker, they first discovered the bodies of the Goebbels children. The face of the eldest daughter, Helga, was blackened from cyanide asphyxiation. The younger ones lay as if sleeping, dressed in white nightgowns their mother had put on them beforehand. Magda Goebbels' body showed a gunshot wound to the temple in addition to the cyanide. Joseph Goebbels lay a few meters away, also with 2 methods, pistol and poison. Ivan Klimenko, intelligence officer of the Smersh military counterintelligence service, was one of the first to descend into the bunker proper. That same day, the search for Hitler's remains began. They would be found on May 5th, the body identified primarily by the teeth, cross-referenced against records from Hitler's personal dentist Hugo Blaschke, who was subsequently captured. The iconic photograph taken by Yevgeny Khalday of the red flag over the Reichstag, raised on April 30th by Sergeants Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, already flew at dawn on May 2nd in a retouched version prepared for propaganda. Khalday had added smoke and adjusted the second wristwatch on the soldier supporting his comrade, because one of the 2 watches he wore was clearly looted and compromised the heroic image. 10 a.m. The first acts of fraternization began. Soviet soldiers shared rations of black bread and canned meat with Berlin civilians who had not eaten in days. The paradox was exact. The same units that had committed mass rape for weeks were now distributing food. They were not necessarily the same men. Soviet discipline, drastically tightened by Stalin's order from April 25th onward, in response to Western diplomatic complaints, had begun to be enforced with severity. Some soldiers who had committed rape were summarily shot by their own officers. The vast majority never faced any accountability. Consider the paradox. The same men handing out bread had fired on children hours before. The same men offering chocolate to one mother had raped another mother the previous night. The war did not end in a single instant. It ended in layers, contradictorily, in simultaneous gestures of barbarism and compassion that no one could reconcile. 11 a.m. In the Tiergarten, columns of German prisoners began forming for the march to Soviet internment points. 480,000 German soldiers would be captured in the Battle of Berlin. A significant proportion of them would die in the following months from disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition in Soviet camps. Final estimated figures speak of approximately 100,000 deaths in captivity among those specifically captured in Berlin, though the records are fragmentary. Among the prisoners were survivors of the SS Division Nordland, Danes, Norwegians, Dutch, Swedes, and French volunteers who had fought under the German flag until the last day. The division's commander, SS General Gustav Krukenberg, who had led the defence of the Chancellery sector with the Charlemagne division composed of French volunteers, was captured attempting to escape through the subway tunnels to the north of the city. Krukenberg would remain in Soviet captivity until 1955. 12 p.m. The sun reached its zenith over Berlin. For the first time in 15 days there were no bombardments, no artillery, no aircraft. In some neighbourhoods the silence was absolute. In others, it was replaced by the cries of the wounded, the moaning of the dying in improvised hospitals, and the sound of Soviet engines advancing along the avenues. On Alexanderplatz, the emblematic square of central Berlin, now turned to rubble. The first teams of civilians supervised by Soviet officers began preliminary clean-up operations, not to rebuild, but to open paths for vehicles. The so-called Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, would not begin their organised work until days later, but the first hands to move stones that afternoon were those of Berliners compelled to do so, frequently at gunpoint. We moved corpses from the debris. We had no gloves. We had nothing. We moved corpses with our bare hands because a soldier was pointing a submachine gun at us, and that was all we needed to understand. Erna Senger, housewife, war widow since 1942. 1 p.m. in the underground hospital of the Charité, Chief Surgeon Ferdinand Sauerbruch, one of the country's leading medical figures, was treating the wounded without distinction of uniform. Sauerbruch, who had been close to the regime in the 1930s and had later distanced himself after learning details of the T4 euthanasia program, had remained in Berlin throughout the siege. At 70 years old, he operated with the same technique with which he had revolutionized thoracic surgery in the early decades of the century. That afternoon, he operated on a Soviet soldier with a shrapnel-perforated lung. The soldier survived. Sauerbruch never wanted to know his name. 2 p.m. in the area of the Berlin Zoo, the massive concrete anti-aircraft bunker known as the Zooflak Tower, a colossal structure with walls 3.5 meters thick that had sheltered 30,000 civilians during the final bombardments, officially surrendered. Its commander, Luftwaffe Colonel Hans Walter, emerged through this main door with a white flag. The bunker had continued to function even after the city's electricity failed, thanks to its autonomous generators. Inside were hospitals, dormitories, storerooms, and even artworks transferred from Berlin's museums for safekeeping. The bust of Nefertiti, one of the most valuable pieces in the Egyptian museum, had been hidden in its depths. When Soviet soldiers entered the interior, they found more than 15,000 people crammed together in catastrophic sanitary conditions. Those who had died of disease and malnutrition were being taken to a basement that served as an improvised morgue. Women had cut sheets into makeshift bandages. Children who had gone days without seeing natural light stepped outside, shielding their eyes. 2:45 p.m. The last isolated skirmishes continued in the Spandau district and in parts of the north of the city. Small groups of foreign SS men, knowing that Soviet capture meant certain death for them as national traitors in their home countries, were attempting to break through to the west to surrender to the British or Americans. Most did not make it. 3 p.m. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon of May 2nd, 1945, the unconditional surrender of the Berlin garrison formally came into force. The loudspeakers broadcast the order again. Weapons were to be laid down. Officers were to report to designated Soviet command posts. Any further resistance would be treated as banditry and punished with summary execution. Berlin had fallen. But the hours following the fall were not hours of calm. In many respects, they were the most confused and dangerous hours of all. With military discipline suspended in some Soviet units, with thousands of German soldiers hiding or attempting to flee in civilian disguise, and with Berlin's population emerging from basements for the first time in weeks, the city became a theatre of constant friction. 5 p.m. On a street in the Wedding District, a Soviet soldier attempted to drag a young woman into a doorway. He was intercepted by a Soviet officer on horseback, belonging to a Kazakh cavalry unit. The officer, without a word, drew his pistol and shot the soldier in the leg. Then he continued on his way. The woman fled. The soldier, bleeding, was collected by his comrades. The scene was witnessed by at least 4 Berlin civilians, whose statements were preserved in complaint files compiled by the Soviet government in later years. Such episodes repeated themselves throughout the city that afternoon and night. The enforcement of Soviet discipline was uneven, contradictory, frequently arbitrary. In some sectors, officers restored order with immediate force. In others, the anarchy persisted for days. 6 p.m. at the Jewish cemetery of Weißensee, one of the few Jewish spaces in Berlin to have survived the Nazi fury for absurd bureaucratic reasons, a group of surviving Berlin Jews began to emerge from the hiding places where they had been concealed for years. These were the so-called U-Boote, the submarines, the clandestine Jews sheltered by German families at the risk of their own lives. Of the more than 160,000 Jews who had lived in Berlin in 1933, barely 1,400 had survived in hiding within the city. Many did not come out until days later. They did not dare believe the war was over. For years I had not spoken my own name aloud. That afternoon I spoke it quietly, in front of a destroyed wall. It seemed to me that the word no longer belonged to me. Inge Deutschkron, survivor, 8 p.m. The light began to fade over the city. Berlin entered its first night of the postwar. The darkness was not complete, because hundreds of fires continued burning at various points. Buildings struck by artillery that had been smouldering for days reignited from drafts of air or secondary explosions of stored ammunition. In the streets, Soviet patrols began imposing informal curfews. Civilians still moving about returned to their basements. The difference from the preceding nights was that they could now sleep without expecting a shell to destroy the building above their heads. But they could expect other things. The sound of boots on the stairs, the scream of a neighbour, the forced door. 9 p.m. In Pankow, in a house where 3 families had taken refuge, a 52-year-old woman named Elsa Wendel gathered her 2 daughters and her elderly mother. On the table were 4 cups of water and 4 cyanide capsules. That is the image preserved in the Soviet police file of the district, recorded by the officer assigned to the following day's report. Else had decided it was better to die. Her eldest daughter Inge, 22 years old, refused. She took the capsules away from her. She threw them into the fire. The argument lasted through the night. All 4 survived. My daughter saved me from cowardice. I had confused fear with dignity. My daughter taught me that night that surviving is also a form of resistance. Else Wendel, writing decades later, 11 p.m. in the Reichstag. Cyrillic inscriptions already covered the interior walls. Soviet soldiers had begun carving their names and home villages into the marble and painted surfaces. Messages for fallen comrades. Messages for their families. Curses against Hitler. Declarations of love for Stalin. The Reichstag inscriptions would become one of the strangest historical marks of the battle, partially preserved in the building's restoration in the 1990s. 11:30 p.m. a Soviet unit entered a pharmacy in the Mitte district. They were looking for painkillers for their wounded. They found the pharmacist, a 60-year-old man named Otto Heckler, dead on the floor. Beside him, his wife. Beside them, empty bottles of Veronal, a barbiturate. They had left a note: "We do not wish to live in the world that is coming." That note, collected in a Soviet archive and translated into Russian, is preserved in the State Archives of Moscow under the corresponding inventory code of the Berlin Civilian Inventory, May 1945. 11:45 p.m. tram on line 22, stopped on a broken track since April 24th, was struck by a secondary explosion. The charred remains of 5 civilians who had sheltered inside during the final bombardments flew through the air. They were already corpses. They had been lying there for days, but their explosion, almost at the stroke of midnight, was one of the last violent sounds of May 2nd. 12 a.m., May 3rd, 1945. Berlin officially entered its second day of peace. The balance sheet of those 24 hours was difficult to calculate with precision even decades later. More than 20,000 civilian dead over the course of the entire Battle of Berlin. More than 80,000 Soviet soldiers fallen in the operation. Figures for raped women that German medical sources drawing on hospital records cross-referenced during the 1950s, place between 100,000 and 2 million for the entirety of the territories occupied by the Red Army, with particular density in Berlin. Documented suicides that in the first week of May exceeded 7,000 in the capital alone, according to records from the health district reorganised under Soviet administration in June. The overall unconditional surrender of the Third Reich would be signed 6 days later, on May 8, in Reims, and subsequently in Karlshorst. But the war had ended in Berlin on May 2nd. It had ended in a room in Tempelhof, at a table where a humiliated German general and a cold Soviet general signed a document while 2 million people, in basements and on streets, tried to understand what it meant to still be alive. The city that in 1936 had welcomed the Olympic Games with parades, new monuments, and a regime proclaiming itself millennial was now a landscape of ruins. The clocks had stopped at different hours, depending on when the shell had struck each building. In the Tiergarten, over the crater where Hitler had been cremated, someone had placed a white flower that afternoon, plucked from a surviving flower bed. Soviet soldiers removed it several times. The next day it reappeared. That flower, anonymous, unsigned, without a clear addressee, without apparent meaning, was the last image some Berliners retained of May 2nd, 1945. A white flower that kept coming back, as though the city, before it even knew what it was going to become, was already trying, against all evidence, to remember.